Du Bois, and I'm recording now, by the way. Something that you may find interesting about Du Bois is that he was actually a student of not Charles Sanders Peirce, the author that we read last week, but Pierce's close colleague and friend, William James. Let me see if I can actually get a whiteboard going here. Okay, can folks see my whiteboard? Can I get a thumbs up on that? Cool, got some thumbs up. All right. Haven't done this in a while. Haven't had an online class since the pandemic. So let me see. I guess I'm gonna try. I guess I'll try to write with the pen. We'll see how that works. Okay. So the author that we read today went by the name W.E.B. Du Bois. Actually, I'm definitely gonna have to type because this is going to be silly to do this. Let me find the text here. Okay. W.E.B. Du Bois, and that is how he pronounced his name, Du Bois. WEB stood for William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And Du Bois lived from 1868 to 1963. Actually, it's notable that he died on August 27th, 1963, because the very next day, the day after Du Bois died, was the day that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., as part of an event that was called the March on Washington. I Have a Dream. People probably have heard that speech before. And I believe that on that day, I don't know if King necessarily commented on Du Bois's death, but I believe that others at the march did comment on the death. So you'll notice from the birth and death dates in Du Bois's life that he was born just a few years after the end of the Civil War, the quote unquote legal or theoretical end of slavery in the United States. And he lived, well into the 20th century when the process of racial desegregation had begun in the United States. I just mentioned that he died the day before King gave that famous speech. King's speech is often seen kind of, as the pinnacle of the civil rights movement, the moment when, a significant number, if not the majority of the American people were kind of raised to consciousness of, the problem of racism that still existed in the southern part of the United States and other parts of the United States as well, but it was particularly bad in the South. And interestingly, sadly, on that day when King gave his speech, Du Bois himself was living in the African nation of Ghana. And he had moved there basically because he was so bothered by, harassed by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies in the United States that near the end of his life, he revoked his American citizenship. He said, I no longer want to be a citizen of the United States. And he actually moved to Africa and lived the last 10 or 20 years of his life in that country. In between that, Du Bois led a really, in my opinion, like pretty amazing life. Um, he was born in a town in Massachusetts called Great Barrington. And I'm sorry, by the way, my whiteboard skills here are not great, but I will post these whiteboard slides after class. So he was born in a town called Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and he was born a free person. Um, Ancestors of his on both sides of his family, as far as he knew, had been enslaved at different points in history. In fact, his maternal great great grandfather, a man whose name we believe is Tom Burghardt, was a veteran, was a slave in the United States, but was also a veteran of the U.S. Revolutionary War. And I know this, by the way, just by kind of reading biographies of Du Bois, including the one that's on Wikipedia, which actually does have a pretty good entry about Du Bois. And there's some speculation that the reason why Du Bois's great great grandfather on his mother's side was freed from slavery was because he fought in the war. This was not uncommon in the Revolutionary War and other military conflicts in the United States, that if an enslaved person fought for the United States Army or other branch of the military, they might be granted freedom at the end of their service. And we believe that may have been the case with Du Bois's great great grandfather. On the other side of his family, Du Bois's dad's side of the family, the history, frankly, is a bit more complex and a little more dark, in that it's believed that at least somewhere in Du Bois's family tree, there was probably some form of sexual exploitation against one of his female relatives on that side of the family by a white European. Not an American, by the way. I believe we think that this happened in the Caribbean islands and that the person was of Dutch or other ancestry. And all of this is really just to say that although Du Bois was born free, in the state of Massachusetts, even though Great Barrington was a very progressive community, it wasn't as though he was not unfamiliar with the experiences of enslaved people, and therefore, kind of the experience of racism in the United States as it existed at the beginning of his life in 1868. Now, you may have seen in what you read by him, these selections from his book, The Souls of Black Folk. And I guess I'll mention that the selection that you read from Du Bois was published in 1903. It's part of a book that he wrote called The Souls of Black Folk. I'm going to look behind me real quick just to see if I happen to have a copy on my shelf to show you the book. I don't think I do, by the way. Yeah, sorry. During my life, I've had many different copies of The Souls of Black Folk. I just don't have one on my bookshelf behind me right now. The book, by the way, if you found what you read interesting and you want to read more of the book, it's very easy to find online. It's in the public domain, so it's completely legal for you to find a PDF of the book and print it out and read it. During Du Bois's lifetime, this was probably his most well-known book. But he also wrote many books during his lifetime. He wrote books of history. He wrote books of sociology. He wrote books of art and literary criticism. and he even wrote novels himself. Um, his most important book before The Souls of Black Folk was a 1899 book that he wrote called, and it uses a term that we don't really use anymore, but he obviously didn't mean it as a slur, and I don't mean it that way either. It's just the title of the book, which is The Philadelphia Negro. And that book was actually the published version of his doctoral dissertation. So in 1895, Du Bois became the first African American person to receive a PhD from from Harvard. And what's really notable about that is that not only did he not only was he the first person to first black person to receive a PhD from Harvard, his dissertation, The Philadelphia Negro, was really innovative for the time when he wrote it. As part of his studies in getting his PhD, Du Bois was able to travel to Germany. This is before World War II. This is before Hitler and all that stuff. But he traveled to Germany, and when he was in Germany, he met with probably the most famous sociologist of all time. I think there's a few of you that might be studying sociology or have taken a sociology class. A man named Max Weber. In German, you pronounce your W's like V's. Weber lived from 1864 to 1920. He's kind of thought of as like I said, the father of modern sociology. And his most famous book is called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Some of you may have learned about this before. Some of you may have read it. That book was actually published after Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folk, in 1905. And it wasn't actually translated into English until 1930. But Du Bois was familiar with Weber's work. And he studied, he didn't actually, my understanding is he didn't study directly with Weber when he was in Germany, but he knew of Weber's work and he knew of the people that some of the other people that Weber had trained. And the main thing that Du Bois took from Weber, which didn't really exist yet in the United States, but now you can start to think about how I told you that Du Bois was a student of William James, Pierce's friend, who lived from 1842 to 1910. Just to remind you, Pierce lived from 1839 to 1914. So here in the U.S., Du Bois studied with James. He was exposed to kind of this new pragmatic conception of philosophy. He would have been familiar, probably, with what James called the pragmatic maxim from Pierce. Let me see. I didn't necessarily expect that I was going to read this out, but I think I have my copy of Pierce right here, so I can read you that maxim, which I'm sure all of you have memorized by now anyway. That's a joke. Consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. When I read that quote right now, just to myself, and I reflect on what I just reread from Du Bois, I think about certain terms in Du Bois, like the color line, like double consciousness, which I'm going to explain to you in a moment. And I think about how, you know, Du Bois is trying to tackle and say something about, what is in reality is a very confusing, in a lot of ways upsetting, um, and for him personally, for Du Bois personally at that time, a kind of like serious problem that he's dealing with as a Black person in the United States. And that is, racism, or what he calls the color line, which I think that's really interesting too. I encourage you to think about that he doesn't actually, I don't even know if he uses in the piece of Souls of Black Folk that we read, I don't think he uses the term racism. He uses the term race, but I don't think he uses the term racism. Um, his word for racism is the problem of the color line. And I think it's interesting to think about that in regards to the effects of racism, in terms of the effects of color difference, so-called, between white Americans, Black Americans, and Americans of other ethnic backgrounds, or some might say racial backgrounds, although I think that's a problematic term in that context. I put next to the term double consciousness, which I'll show you that quote in Du Bois in a second, the James's name, because it's actually interesting that the term double consciousness that Du Bois uses, he uses it in a different way from James, but he actually got that term. He probably first read that term in some of William James's writing. I think I mentioned to you how James, who was Peirce's, kind of best friend and strongest intellectual collaborator, is sometimes thought of as the father of U.S. psychology. I'll actually double check the date. James published an important book about psychology in 1890 called The Principles of Psychology, which was basically like the first, not just in the United States, but like anywhere in the world. It was basically like, again, the first, what I would call kind of like empirical study of psychology. In other words, the first kind of like evidence-based study of psychology that would be really similar if you did a psychology degree today. It's probably pretty similar to the kind of stuff you'd be doing, lab experiments, kind of testing hypotheses about the human mind in order to develop a deeper understanding of it. So Du Bois is coming out of that tradition. He goes to Germany. He learns about this kind of new sociological method for understanding how society works. And then he comes back to the United States and writes his doctoral dissertation, which is called The Philadelphia Negro. And what that book is just a study, a sociological study of Black people living in Philadelphia at the end of the 1800s. And it's, in a word, you could kind of describe it as scientific. Like he goes, I think he had other people do this for him. It was like he had people hired. He hired people to do this, and he went to the city of Philadelphia, which he wasn't from. Like I said, he was from Massachusetts, and he basically just studied how the people in Philadelphia lived. So he like asked them questions. How many people live in your house? What does everybody in the house do for a living? How much money do you have? How many kids do you have? Did you move here from another part of the country? Do you want to leave Philadelphia? All that kind of stuff that if you've taken a sociology class or if you've heard of sociology before, you probably understand that that's the kind of work that sociologists do. Now, when you read Souls of Black Folk, the piece you read for today, it doesn't look like that at all, right? I mean, the second chapter you read, which was titled, just reminding myself of the title real quick, Of the Dawn of Freedom, which started on what's labeled in the bottom corner of your PDF as page 10 out of 141. That chapter is a little more scientific than the first chapter because it like has like a lot of dates and a lot of names, and it's specifically talking about this period in U.S. history after the Civil War called Reconstruction. It's generally thought that Reconstruction lasts from some point within the Civil War. So the Civil War is 1861 to 65. And then the Civil War ends, and then Reconstruction continues until 1876. The term Reconstruction, it's pretty, the title is, it's pretty representative of what Reconstruction was. It was the attempt after the Civil War to reconstruct the South. At one point in the chapter you read, Du Bois mentions how during the Civil War, a certain General Sherman, who some of you may have heard of before, basically adopted a policy in the South that was called scorched earth. So, as I think about it right now, the word civil and Civil War in certain ways almost even reminds me of the title of Thoreau's essay, Resistance to Civil Government. I mean, a civil war is called a civil war because it's a war between citizens or, just subjects within a state or republic. In that sense, I guess you could call it civil because it's between equals, so to speak, at the beginning of the war. But as you know about the Civil War, it was an extremely violent, bloody, and kind of deeply emotional conflict between the northern and southern states. And there was definitely a point in the war where the northern generals and probably a lot of the soldiers and political leaders just were kind of fed up with the South and the kind of insanity of fighting a war basically in order to preserve slavery. So this General Sherman adopted this wartime policy. Today it would probably be considered a war crime. I don't even think it would be allowed under international law today. But of what was called scorched earth, where when he would go into a town or village or city in the South, he would evacuate the women and children. He would either send them to a refugee camp or encourage them to come with him to the next, follow his army to the next town or whatever. And then he would just destroy everything in the town, burn down every building, steal as much crops and natural resources as he could, because the goal of the Northern Army at that point was, we got to finish this battle, got to finish this war. So at the end of the Civil War, the South was just in ruins. The city of Atlanta, which was the biggest city in the South, was just rubble. It was just the entire thing had been burnt to the ground, and it wasn't by accident. It was intentional in order to punish the rebels who had come out of that area. And, as you can imagine, after the war was over in 1865, there were a lot of questions like, what do we do with the South? Do we put all the people that fought for the South in jail? Do we execute them? Do we ever let them participate in politics anymore? Um, you know, in a lot of the southern states, Mississippi, I think Alabama, I think Georgia, there were more enslaved people than there were free people. So you're going from a situation where the majority of the population is dominated by a white supremacist minority to a situation where this huge number of people who have been enslaved arguably had a lot of skills. I mean, the slaves of the South were the working class of the South. They were the workers. The Southern economy would not exist, obviously, without the labor of the enslaved people. But as you can imagine, there's all kinds of problems with this. If you had been, or your family member had been enslaved during the, during the war, or before the war, I should say, you wouldn't want to, you wouldn't want to work for that person again. But at the same time, and Du Bois addresses this. There were a lot of people that thought we should just give the land to the enslaved people. He says at one point, you can find the quote. He says that some people thought it would have been a kind of poetic justice to give the previously enslaved people access to the land and the economy and the politics of the South that the slave owners had previously controlled. But, and there's a lot to be said about this. But it does seem as though history shows that this was easier said than done. That, in part because of the resistance, the continued resistance of the white supremacist elite in the South, that Reconstruction was, most people agree, a kind of a flawed process. Before the end of his life, actually, Du Bois wrote another book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction in the South. I think that during his lifetime, The Souls of Black Folk was kind of thought of as his most important book. But more recently, I think that in part because Black Reconstruction, Souls of Black Folk is a nice little tight 100-page book. Like I said, I don't have a picture of it to show you. Black Reconstruction is like 500 pages long, and it's extremely detailed. It basically tells the same history that you heard him talk about in the second chapter of this book, but it goes into every single little date, every single little piece of legislation, all these kind of statistics and things like that regarding the attempt to reconstruct the South after the Civil War. And the main argument that Du Bois makes in Black Reconstruction in the South is that going against the white historians who had already started to write the history of this period, they basically, and by the way, this school of racist history was called the Dunning School, Dunning. You don't need to know that, but I'm just mentioning it in case people are interested. And the basic idea of the Dunning School was that it was the enslaved people's fault that Reconstruction had failed. The Dunning School basically put forward the idea that, slavery had some bad parts. Generally speaking, enslavement is not a good thing. But, it's not like the United States was the only country that had slavery. Like basically every culture in the history of the world has had slavery in it at some point. There's still arguably forms of slavery that exist even into today. In other words, like people that are doing work without being paid, sometimes being forced to do it, like an example of like sexual slavery or something like that. Um, and the Dunning School kind of had the theory that, like, if you had either let the South, you know, uh, go about abolishing slavery in its own way, if you would kind of just let history take its course, slavery probably would have ended on its own in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It had ended in other parts of the world by that point. The serfs were SERFs were freed in Russia a little bit after the end of the Civil War. Some countries in the Western Hemisphere, like Brazil, had slavery all the way up until the 1880s. And when it was abolished by law, not by violence. And so the Dunning School kind of said, like, that the reason why Reconstruction failed was basically like northern, white northern politicians basically kind of like meddling in the affairs of the South and, trying to liberate people that were not ready for liberation. This is the Dunning School. Du Bois, this view of history, frankly, made Du Bois furious. It's in the simplest terms, he saw it as like victim blaming. You're basically, saying to people that, you're basically saying to people that just went through, one of the most horrible experiences that a human being can go through, being held and treated as a slave. And then you're saying after they're freed, the fact that they can't like get their stuff together right away to reconstruct their society is like that person's fault. And they're doing this, and like in the second chapter that you read, Du Bois mentions like the Ku Klux Klan. This was the period Reconstruction when the Ku Klux Klan was created. So it wasn't like, it would be one thing if you said, like, well, the enslaved people, they had all the support in the world, and they still messed this up, like that. They have to take some responsibility for that. The during the period of Reconstruction, the attempts of both the Northern government and the liberated people to organize themselves were being fought at every point, by the Ku Klux Klan, by, frankly, guerrilla warfare that kind of continued after the official war had ended. And really, there's people, historians today, and I guess I kind of consider myself one of them, that in many ways, the Civil War, the issues that were at play in the Civil War have never really been resolved in the United States. And I think that this is something that Du Bois was very aware of when he was writing Souls of Black Folk and Black Reconstruction in the US. Again, I think that this idea is very much, summarized in his term, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Right after he makes that statement, he says that the Civil War was but a first phase in this conflict, in this problem. So that's a general overview of Du Bois's life. Just to mention how Reconstruction ended, because this is pretty interesting too, if you don't know the story. So Du Bois describes for you how after the Civil War, and even starting during the Civil War, you had the Northern political leaders saying to themselves, we got to figure out a way how to deal with this war, that, reconstructing from this war. And they, we got to figure out how to reconstruct things from this war. So they they created this thing. Du Bois talks about the Freedmen's Bureau. He talks about the Freedmen's Bank. These were institutions that were set up by the government to try to provide services to the liberated slaves in order to help them reconstruct the South. Like I said, it was almost as though, even though the treaties were signed, the war was like still going on. You know, when Black people would try to vote, when they would try to start businesses, there would be lynchings, there would be attacks by the KKK. There were just organized militias and stuff like that that were still kind of fighting in little corners of the former Confederacy. And the Northern government was getting really frustrated with it. So what happened in 1876 was there was a presidential election between a Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes and a Democrat named James Tilden. Now, at that time, as I mentioned before, the parties were kind of switched in terms of their political orientations. So the Republican Party at that time was the kind of more progressive abolitionist party that had supported the effort to end slavery during the Civil War. The Democrats, and by the way, aspects of this, facet of the Democratic Party actually continue until after World War II. But the Democrats, were kind of more like the party. They were kind of a unified party between Northern elites, so like bankers, traders, shipbuilders, like people like that, like the tech bros of the 1800s, and Southern slave owners, the Southern aristocracy. That was who supported the Democratic Party in 1876. So what happened was that, you got to remember, this is 1876. You don't even have telephones yet. You do have telegraphs and stuff like that. Well, what basically happened is that the federal government couldn't decide who won the presidential election. There were delegations from the different states coming to Washington, D.C., and some of them were saying the Republican Hayes won. Some of them were saying that the Democrat Tilden won. And basically what happened was a thing called the Compromise of 1877. The election took place in 76, but the compromise was struck in 77, where the Democrats said, okay, we can't settle the Electoral College, so the vote is going to go to Congress. That's how the disputes get settled in the case. Actually, I think it goes to the state legislatures of the different states. So the Democrats said, we'll vote in Hayes, the Republican, even though we don't concede that he won. We'll vote Hayes in, but you basically have to end Reconstruction. So the Union Army, the U.S. Army, has to leave the South, and whatever happens, kind of. If a lot of Black people get killed or get basically re-enslaved or get put in jail or whatever, that's just going to happen. And the Republicans accepted this. So that was the end of Reconstruction. And, Du Bois basically, in Black Reconstruction in the U.S., he basically sees this as the Republicans selling out his people, selling out the former slaves, the now Black American citizens of the South to, Northern capitalists and politicians. Sorry, my computer's doing this weird. It's like a AI movie director or something. So that's the historical context in which Du Bois is writing all this. And you probably noticed that unlike the other books of his I've told you about, the Philadelphia Negro and Black Reconstruction in the South, Souls of Black Folk, it includes some kind of empirical sociological data and information. It has some historical dates. It has a lot of names and things like that. But it's also obviously a very personal reflection by Du Bois on what he says is his experience of feeling like a problem. So he says that right in the first paragraph that you read from his book. He says, um, between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter round it. They approach me in a half hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, a battle during the Civil War, or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these, I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. So I don't know what other people think about it, and if folks want to raise their hand now or in a few moments, we probably will have a little bit of time to start the conversation, at least about this stuff later on. But I find the way that Du Bois here, and of course I'm a person of Irish American, some Eastern European ancestry. I believe that most of my relatives came to the United States, after, as immigrants in the 19th century. I think I might have mentioned to you guys that I'm actually kind of like researching parts of my family tree. I actually think I might have a relative who fought in the Civil War on the good side, on the Union side. So I will say that I definitely don't have the same experiences with racism or what Du Bois calls the color line as he did. Um, in a way, I think you could say, no matter what your racial background is, no matter what your ethnic background is, we're all kind of, we're living in a much different time than Du Bois is. Presumably, we've all had very different experiences than Du Bois is. But I find the way that he writes about these things to be really eloquent, to be really provocative without being preachy, without always spelling things out. So he says that basically what he's saying here is and to understand, Du Bois was for a for a black person at that time, and really for a person of any race at that time, he was a relatively privileged person. He grew up in a really kind of nice, quiet, pretty northern town. My wife right now is watching that show Gilmore Girls. I don't know if you guys have any of you have seen that show, but like I'm assuming Great Barrington, the town where Du Bois grew up, is probably a lot like Stars Hollow, this kind of cute little New England town. That's where Du Bois grew up. But what he's saying here is that, even though he grew up relatively comfortably, and even though he's achieved so much in his life, by the time he writes this book, he has a PhD. He's the first black man in the United States to get a PhD from Harvard. He's not only just, and he's not just following academic trends. He's setting trends. He's bringing new ideas into the United States from Europe, and also from other parts of the world. And he still gets treated like a problem. He still hears people going out of their way to kind of indicate to him, I'm one of the good white people. I fought. I guess you could say I almost just did what he says the person who says they fought at Mechanicsville did. In a sense, trying to make up for the injustices of racism by, invoking some special thing that I did or some relative of mine did, to try to combat it. And what Du Bois says is that, this experience of being a problem creates within Black Americans what he calls, on the second page that you read, but it's labeled 5 out of 141 in the middle of the page, what he calls double consciousness. Now, this term double consciousness is a controversial term still today. There's a lot of debate about double consciousness. Some people who like Du Bois, they're not trying to argue against him, but they still think that this idea is a problem, that it's kind of almost like too poetic. It's too metaphorical. It doesn't really describe the experience of racism, the psychological experience of alienation on the basis of a person's race. But there's other people who, think that this idea is still extremely supple, fruitful, worth pursuing. And I'm going to read you what Du Bois says about it initially here in just a second. But there's a question of, another question about double consciousness is, can we apply it to other groups? So I'll just read you what Du Bois writes. This is on the middle of, like I said, page 5 out of 141, the second page of what you read. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields to him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the relation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So something I notice when I read this passage from The Souls of Black Folk is its specificity. Okay? So you'll notice that the list of cultures, ethnicities, civilizations, you might say, that Du Bois mentions at the beginning of this paragraph kind of are listed in chronological order with regards to kind of when those civilizations were at their peak. So he mentions Egyptian civilization, which in many ways, most historians would agree was the first kind of, great, long-lasting imperial civilization in the north of Africa, but which had reach all through the African continent and up into the Middle East and other parts of the world. When the Egyptian Empire was at its peak, Europe was, still, honestly, like almost like cavemen still in terms of their culture and civilization. He then mentions Indian civilization, which, as far as we know, developed before the great ancient civilizations of Europe, Greece, and Rome. Some of you may know that almost all European languages have their roots in the Indian subcontinent in an ancient language called Sanskrit. And then he mentions, like I said, the great civilizations of ancient Europe, Greek and Roman, the Teuton, which is like Germanic, Anglo-Saxon civilization, and Mongolian, which is frankly probably a politically incorrect and maybe kind of slightly racist word on Du Bois's part, describing Asian civilization in general. And he's seeing what he's calling the Negro as kind of the latest civilization to emerge under the light, the sun, whatever you want to say, of human progress. And when he talks about this double consciousness, you know, he definitely knows about the diversity of African or Black civilization around the world. Some of you may be familiar with the term diaspora, which is used to describe groups of people who, usually because of political and economic military reasons, have had to leave their home countries, home states, home regions, and move to other parts of the world. People like Du Bois would think of African people as a diasporic population. Jewish people are a diasporic population. Irish people are a diasporic population. Armenian people are a diasporic population. And so I definitely think when he uses the term Negro, when he actually mentions Egypt, which is part of Africa at the beginning of his list, I think he's kind of indicating to you that he's thinking in diasporic terms. But he then specifically grounds double consciousness in and I like the phrase he uses here, this American world. That word world is a kind of interesting term to choose, right? He doesn't say American, country, state, nation, community, land, homeland, whatever. He says world, because he's very sensitive to the unique aspects of American civilization and the unique situation into which the descendants of African people in the United States have been put. And, in this piece, in this bit of Souls of Black Folk and elsewhere in this book and other writing, Du Bois describes this double consciousness in a lot of different ways, but, just check in with you about it. It's in some ways ambivalent. Double consciousness is kind of an ambivalent concept. On one hand, he compares it to a second sight, which is like a term for a person that can predict the future. So it's like it's got a prophetic aspect to it. But it's also kind of almost like a disability in some ways too, where, just to take Du Bois's personal example, I hope people understood what he was saying, but he basically says, the first time I came to realize that I was a problem, talking in Du Bois's voice, was he gives this very kind of, it's pretty sad, very emo kind of story about how he was at school and the kids were handing out cards to each other, like Valentine's Day cards or something. He doesn't mention Valentine's Day, I don't think, but it reminds me of that. We used to do that in my elementary school. And when you did that, right, you were supposed to bring a Valentine for everybody in your class. um, because you didn't want anybody to feel left out. But he talks about how one of the white students in his class would not accept his card or his greeting card. And he says, that's when I realized that I was different from these folks, even though, he grew up in this relatively progressive community, even though he probably lived 6 or 7 or 8 years of his life or whatever without really thinking about race or color difference. In this moment, it was kind of brought home to him that he was, as he puts it, living behind a veil that separated him from the rest of his peers. So, okay, I appreciate people coming to the online session. I am going to post this as a video after class is over. If you want to go back and listen to it again, I'm going to stop the recording right now.